Cities Skylines 2. Hold on. Shit. It's here somewhere, but that one's not right either. Cities Skylines 2 has launched today, and as you can see, not so hot on the review front, unless of course you're looking at the Metacritic scores, where only 1 out of 45 had a negative experience with Cities Skylines 2. Of course, in this video, we're going to focus on what has been a highly turbulent launch for Cities 2, frankly, not performing anywhere near what it needs to do. We'll also look at some solutions offered by Paradox themselves in this Tips, our guide to optimize performance for Cities Skylines 2, which they released alongside the game. They say it's important to them that everyone has access to as smooth of a gaming experience as possible. And while varying hardware may present different challenges, they're here to support and guide us through for the best experience. The first line, however, Cities Skylines 2 is a performance-heavy game, and with the diverse array of hardware you as a player use, you might find this guide helpful. Just me, or just slightly gaslighting? It's your diverse hardware that's causing this performance-heavy experience. And of course that is true. I mean, this is a very rich and detailed simulation, and if it was performing well, I'd say it would be the definitive city builder. However, it does not. And as I talked about in my video earlier, a couple of days ago, my system actually shouldn't really be one of those ones that's struggling. I took on a hefty amount of credit card debt to ensure that I could make videos like this, and it just doesn't work well enough for Cities Skylines. Certainly Cities Skylines 2. If you missed it, the real quick sort of 15-second catch-up, basically I reviewed Cities Skylines as a really solid city builder, like probably one of the best if it actually worked. And frankly, performance is by far and away such a significant issue that it kind of just takes away from the whole experience. And of course, we've seen that already in this introduction. So let's now take a look actually at the sort of scale of the problem and that massive elephant in the room, performance, and whether Paradox's solutions actually make a difference. I'll show you them all, and then we'll talk a little bit about it. Let's roll. Over to the Paradox forums, where they've published this update around performance, their guide to better tips. Firstly, virtual texturing. Basically, when you open up the launcher, you'll get this option to download virtual texturing. In fact, it just happens. They say you should let that happen. It doesn't take long. It is essentially, they say, a technology that allows video memory to be used more efficiently in regards to textures. Then they open up with some, frankly, kind of disappointing recommended settings. The two main ones are screen resolution and depth of field mode. On screen resolution, they recommend running at 1080p at 60 frames per second, which of course won't be a massive issue for a lot of people. There are plenty of 1080p 60 FPS monitors out there. However, if you're running like I am at 1440p, or goodness gracious at 4K, and at a higher refresh rate, you're gonna notice that it just looks a bit blobby, right? Textures just not as crisp, plenty of text and fine details in this game. So yes, you can change this for performance if you want to. They also, of course, said the depth of field mode being disabled. This one does seem to have a reasonable effect. And finally, the one that they touch on specifically for recommended settings is volumetrics quality settings. They recommend disabling volumetrics, which will lower the quality of volumetric clouds. I think it could also be worthwhile to play around with the specific settings here for fog quality, cloud quality, global illumination quality as well. Would be a few that I'd recommend you try and lower. Of course, across the board, just try and lower things and see if it works is generally a good idea, but these ones in particular may net improvements of between 10 and 15 FPS at the moment. At least that's sort of what I can gather. It's probably also fair to note that a lot of this comes on the back of already pretty heavy requirements. If we look at the recommended settings, you're going to need a 12th generation Intel i5 processor, at least 16 gigabytes of RAM, and an RTX 3080. Woof! Minimum requiring a GTX 970. Good luck to you, sir. Back to Paradox's advice. After recommended settings, they introduce motion blur, depth of field, dynamic resolution. They say that these settings won't always improve your performance, but they want to help you understand what these settings are and hopefully help solve why does my game look like this questions. The first, depth of field and motion blur, they say can cause the game to look very strange, and motion sickness can cause low FPS to feel even worse. So maybe not a performance issue, but kind of a look and feel issue instead. Slight differentiation there. They say that tilt shift, depth of field, and motion blur can be very visually disruptive if you're already struggling with the low FPS, so a good idea perhaps to disable or strip those down, and that way you might find it just looks a bit better. Another one to pay attention to, of course outside of just general global graphics quality, will be the dynamic resolution scale quality. Here, disabling it has an interesting effect. Dynamic resolution can save frames per second, but it might make the game look a little bit blurry. For me, constant worked best, although you might run into some anti-aliasing issues around the edges with any of these modes, so it's important also to maybe delve into some of the more advanced stuff and tinker with it, but I wouldn't worry about that too much if you're the average player. If you're the average player, go through the ones that we've looked at, and of course in general advice, lower the graphics quality overall. Obviously, not the greatest news to hear on release day. Now, if you are running into issues common or maybe relatively unknown, don't forget the Paradox Forum is probably the place to report them. Obviously a freaking active forum at the moment. I'll link that as well as anything else that I've made reference to in this video below, as always, in the sources section of the description. Now, cutting to some post-performance fix gameplay. This was me first loading it up. I followed all of their instructions, including the screen resolution, every single thing. As you can see, game's still not really performing that well on a 4090, a 12th generation i9 Intel processor, everything that you would need, really, to run most games. At least at 1080p 60 FPS, and obviously as you can tell by the hitching, I'm not even getting my 60 frames or 120 frames, in my case, that I was promised. I found actually that swapping back to automatic dynamic scaling at least helped a little bit with some of those SimCity 2013 looking edges. But of course, performance still just honestly a little bit tricky. Clearly playing at 60 frames per second would make a difference, and if you want to change your monitor, have it running at 60 FPS, or if you just have one, then that might very well be something that I'm just missing here. So obviously, my system may vary from yours. But as far as the verdict goes from the performance, for me, to be frank, I didn't really notice much of a difference. Maybe 10 frames per second on average, but there's not really even much of a point in me reporting an average because it scales and fluctuates around so wildly. And you'll see that maybe a little bit in the rest of this gameplay as I show you sort of 15-second clips. Some of them working well, positive, totally fine. Others not so much, with graphical issues around shadows, again, frame drops, hitching, all of that kind of thing getting in the way, especially when weather effects are involved, for example. And if I reflect more broadly at the feedback from forums, from Steam, etc., it seems like people have found good results with these performance changes. Some people reporting it completely fixed their game, others not so much. I think it's at least worth trying, and you should probably see a performance improvement somewhere around 10 to 20 frames per second. But again, I would caution that it's probably not going to be all that consistent, and the dynamic aspects of Cities Skylines 2 simulation may very well make it worse. Now, my cheap gag at the start hopefully didn't go miss, and the point sort of underlying here for this last section of the video, my thoughts, feelings, and overall verdict, was of course mentioned right at the start. This launch is messy. Let me spell it out for you if the SimCity 2013 or indeed the other games didn't quite connect with you. This is an ugly launch. There's not really any other way to put it. The Steam reviews are down below 30%. I mean, this is rough. It's also, of course, important to note that games such as No Man's Sky, from my cheap dig in the introduction, or of course Cyberpunk 2077, perhaps more relevant, can improve. Have improved. And both of those titles in particular actually work a lot better now. Now, I'm not trying to sell you hopium, absolutely not. It should be clear that I try and provide free and frank advice wherever I possibly can. However, I do still believe that Cities Skylines 2 is on an upward trajectory. The developers have been really active on that feedback front that we've talked about earlier. They clearly are working very hard on this game, but it is also clearly a game that isn't working particularly hard for me or you, at least right now, in terms of performance. What I'm trying to say here is that I think that the future will still be bright. I do. I think that Cities Skylines 2 has a great suite of features, really interesting economic and social simulations, but take a look at this clip here as I'm trying to place down a college. My city around 16,500 people, so it is getting a little bit bigger. And my goodness, that seems to have an impact as well. In the first few thousand, you'll be all right, but once you start getting into 5-digit populations, as you can see, everything's just a bit clunky. I remain optimistic for Paradox and Colossal Order's sort of collective efforts to make Cities Skylines 2 a brilliant game. And I think that they'll do it, I do. But I'd be really hesitant to put a time frame on it. My guess would be that over the next weeks and months we'll see updates to the game that will significantly focus on performance. And then of course down the line, I'm sure there'll be plenty of DLC on offer. Hey, let me know below how you've gone on. How's your performance going? What kind of hardware are you running? And did these improvements performance work for you? Because clearly they haven't quite worked so well for me. Thank you so much for joining me. It hurts me a little bit to make a video like this about a game that I'm so interested in. Been interested in it for years. Don't look back at the history of the channel. And I am still optimistic for the future. Thanks for watching, everybody. I'll see you next time.